I think the climate so-called denier side suffer from having too little faith in the science. But because actually the science of climate is actually pretty good. And I'll come back to what the problem is. Well, the problem is actually evident on the other side. Because if the climate denier side have too little faith in the physical science of climate, the climate activist side, I think, have too much faith in the social science of society of the impact of climate.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.
Hi guys, my name is Maria Kondjuska-Koper. You are watching Common Sense Generation. And with me is Dr. Calum Nicholson, the head of the research in Danube
Director of
Institute.
Research, Danube Institute. Yeah.
So tell us actually what you're doing.
So I'm recently installed as Director of Research for the Danube Institute. And what we're doing through that institute is looking at how conservatives can do some sort of research and development on frames of reference. Often if you look at conservatives debating really any issue in society, often what they're fighting is not really a problem of the facts, it's a problem of the frame of reference by which they're often interviewed if they go on, say, the BBC. The left has done a very good job at sort of monopolizing the moral high ground. And I think what conservatives need to be able to do is to articulate arguments in moral terms which avoids the utopian thinking of the left. And so what we're trying to do at the Danube Institute, at least what I'm trying to do with the research department, is to work out how we can offer sort of stories, I suppose, or frames of reference for discussing a whole range of different issues from migration to issues to do with gender, or really whatever issue you really choose. Climate is one. And to look at it and say, what would a conservative frame of reference be that avoids the accusations that the left sometimes subject conservatives to, but also avoids the utopian thinking of the left itself?
Utopian thinking of the left, exactly, but very often, especially, so green philosophy, so everything connected to the climate is very much dominated by the left narrative. As I understand, you are a specialist in talking about it in a different way.
Well, I mean, I do talk about it, I think, in a way that's a bit unusual. And so my view of climate is that there are kind of two sides to the climate debate. On the one side, you have the so-called climate activists or the climate believers. On the other side, you have the so-called climate deniers. I think both sides suffer from opposite but equal naiveties, actually. I think the climate so-called denier side suffer from having too little faith in the science. But because actually the science of climate is actually pretty good. And I'll come back to what the problem is. Well, the problem is actually evident on the other side. Because if the climate denier side have too little faith in the physical science of climate, the climate activist side, I think, have too much faith in the social science of society of the impact of climate. And why does that matter? It matters because we care about climate because of two reasons. First, we presume it'll have a social impact. And second, we presume that impact will be negative. That assumption requires us not simply to understand the science of climate, but to also understand what we mean by society, what society is and what society ought to be. The truth is we don't really have very clear answers to what society is and what it ought to be. We all know society exists, but analytically, what is it? How does it operate? What is its relationship to extra-societal factors like climate? These sorts of questions are not easy to answer. And if they were, we wouldn't have 2,500 years of Western philosophy debating precisely questions of what is and ought to be, in this case applied to society. So my sort of short summary is that when you look at climate, we often think that the debate on climate change is informed by a rich understanding of the science. But I think it is as informed by an impoverished understanding of ourselves, of society. So what I'm trying to do in the climate debate is to offer a frame of reference to allow conservatives to make arguments about climate that are perhaps more critical without actually engaging with the science at all. Because the science, I think, is actually pretty good. But actually, even once you've solved all the problems of the science, and the science isn't perfect, but it's pretty good for what it is. But actually, all the really interesting questions remain untouched because they're questions about us. They're about society. And those problems replicate across many other issue areas, many other topics. And so it's a good example of what we want to do with the Danube Institute to innovate in terms of offering new frames of reference for conservatives to make arguments they've been losing to the left for a long time.
But I understand that fully, and it's a very interesting approach. And the fact is that we don't really know what is going to be the impact on, as you said, on our groups of people living in different places. So basically humanity, because it's all together what all the green philosophy refers to. And the fact that it's portrayed as so disastrous that the life on Earth, humans, is very much in danger. But it is not proven that ever has been to this extent in danger, even the climate change before. So I'm not an expert in climate change, definitely I don't want to be. But I see the fact that how much this all debate is led by extreme fear and extreme statement, which very often said by important people at the universities who claim that okay, now the Netherlands are going to be underwater, London is going to be underwater, and it doesn't happen, and they predict it and it doesn't happen, and it doesn't make them just at least reclaim what they said and be in other fields of science. It would be a huge problem if you say something with being so strict about it and then it doesn't happen. So isn't it this debate on climate change comes also from if some huge fear of what are going to be the social changes and what sort of social changes. One of them is, of course, this idea of huge migration, which is going to flood Europe.
Yeah, well, I'd say first that it is true that a lot of the debates, or rather public discussion and discourse around climate is very emotive and very emotionally driven. I don't think strong emotions are a good guide to policymaking. As an analogy to climate for a second, if you remember the pandemic, the British government actually had a pandemic plan to respond to a disease just like COVID, the same basic structure. They threw that plan out of the window, a plan that had been generated dispassionately when there wasn't a crisis, when people were level-headed and cool-headed about it. They threw it out and instead adopted a more knee-jerk, sort of emotive reaction that was probably better politics under the circumstance, giving Italy a lockdown and China a previously lockdown. I think there's a lot of questions that people have and certainly should be asking about the proportionality of the response we had to COVID. Should we have locked down everyone or simply targeted populations or indeed no one, right? And there's an interesting set of debates about, is there more to life than the avoidance of death, These were quite philosophical debates that we didn't have actually at the time, and we should have probably had.
Yes, I think the pandemic was a vivid example of one thing that a lot of people are so dramatically afraid of death. And when you look at Christian values, one of that a Christian shouldn't be that much afraid of death, even though it shouldn't seek way of dying, but basically try to put it in the hands of God and not giving up his own life because of fear.
There's something very interesting. We'll go back to climate, but the COVID example is relevant, I think, because the two debates are patterned very similarly. They're both talking about an extra societal, scientifically understood topic, COVID and climate, and its impact on society. Even the rhetoric around the two issues is similar. Some people said during COVID that if we could simply attain zero COVID, then by locking everyone up, presumably forever, then we could solve the problem. We also hear about carbon net zero, which is the same basic principle. So the two debates have some similarities.
Lock everyone down without electricity or without traveling otherwise and on food.
It's the same thing. Well, something I think though worth mentioning about COVID though, and again, COVID and climate are very similarly patterned debates actually, and we can learn something less about COVID or climate by looking at the comparison between them. We do learn something about ourselves who worry about issues like this, who are concerned for solving the problems we face. There's a very interesting pattern underlying the COVID debate, is that we suddenly decided, without much debate, that there was nothing more important than life. Now, what I find odd about this is that throughout human history, we often have, what we've done in the past is we've sacrificed our youngest, healthiest people with their whole lives ahead of them, because we understand that there are certain things greater than the individual life, the societies we live in. So this is why we send our young people to wars. Now, not all wars are just or necessary, but sometimes when they are, we understand there is a sacrifice that has to be made because there's a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. What was really interesting with COVID, it completely inverted this logic. And it was saying, actually, in order to protect typically people who, and I'm not trying to sound cruel here or anything, but obviously the people affected by COVID tended to be people who were much older and who were in a position where they'd had their life. But what we're saying is we need to sacrifice all the opportunities for everyone younger and everything normal about our society in order to protect, we thought, best protect people exclusively from COVID. And so what we did is we prized life over the parts over the whole instead of the whole over the parts. Now, I'm not really drawing a moral judgment on which was better, but my point is simply there's been a shift in the society's priorities from recognizing that the whole is greater than the parts to now believing only the parts are important, and if you understand what I mean. And there's a very similar pattern with climate, I think.
Yeah, well, extremely important what you mentioned, that suddenly life became the biggest value, which paradoxically for the same group of people who are proclaiming like zero COVID, total lockdown, for example, they're very often pro-abortion. Of course, they will debate that this is not life yet, but still they see, but they don't cherish it in the same way as they cherished in this case. So life, in this case, wasn't the biggest value, but in this one, yes. So I think there was something different, even hidden behind it. And a lot of those things, of course, were driven by some very, very deep fear of death, which maybe because it struck in modern times when we are not anymore so used to encountering death so often as our ancestors, our grandparents, who very often, most of them, lost at least one child.
On this is very interesting that we live in an age where religion's in decline, theology's in decline, but technocracy's on the rise. And it's very interesting that, to me, that these days, if you go back 100 years, if you went to hospital and somehow you survived, they probably needed to do an inquiry to say, how did this person survive? And we all knew there was a risk of death at every point. You could get a cold and die. And so I think people knowing that death was always present, that probably was something that kept faith alive. You needed faith in the face of the vicissitudes of fortune and the potential risks. But what's interesting, whereas 150 years ago, in a sense, and I'm kind of joking when I say this, but they'd have to do an inquiry to work out how did you survive hospital. These days, of course, it's the opposite. Now, if you die, they'll have to do the inquiry to say, how did they die? Because we've become such masters of our fate, in a sense. We've lost the need for faith in theology, and because we have faith in technocracy. And so we think the system will protect us. And there's an interesting interview I remember reading with, I think, Maria Shriver, Arnold Schwarzenegger's ex-wife. And she was, when interviewed, she must have been in her mid-60s. And it was during the pandemic. And she said, in this interview, she said her generation had seen a lot in their lifetime. But I wonder if that was actually true, because sure, her generation were probably the wealthiest and healthiest society or generation in human history. They had the technology to travel anywhere. They had a period of political stability, the baby boomer generation, particularly if you were from the Anglosphere. And so yes, they probably have seen more than a lot of other people. But the question is, did they experience more? Because actually they were so cocooned from the sorts of traumas and tragedies that have affected most people in the world, other people in the world, and certainly previous generations. And it left me wondering whether they whether their experience was forged by fire or frozen by fortune, because they were very fortunate people. And I feel sometimes we've become, and that generation, I think, has created this myth that we have in the West now, that the world's a knowable thing, that life is a predictable experience.
Exactly. This is what you're very right. So I think I lived in the same the dream, which go on and go out. The life is a predictable experience, until two events happened, which completely destroyed. Most of all, the Fukuyama's, of course, idea of the end of the history. One was pandemic, which showed us, okay, there is the danger, and it is possible that a certain amount of people will actually die. I think there was a lot of fear in it, but the collateral damage with the COVID was also very big, because of the hospitals were closed, because the medical health on different issues was actually less effective than it should be. There was damage to the economy and a lot of craziness. And I do think that it was a moment when a lot of people actually could show their common sense, when they saw that certain things don't work, and when the government says we have to close the woods in order to protect the society from COVID, you realize might not be the best way. It's something fishy about it. But what I wanted to say is the fact that there was the shock that, and the second shock, at least for Central Europe, Eastern Europeans, but I think for Americans as well, is the war in Ukraine, which is a proof that humanity is still very bloody, and it's not like experience of World War II has changed that, and the history repeats itself, and the atrocities as my generation, I've read about such atrocities, about Holocaust or Volyn, which were done during the World War II, and now behind the border of European Union is Ukraine, when Russians are doing the same atrocities, and the rest of the world looks at it. And again, if not for American soldiers, no one knows how far it would go.
Well, it's interesting because for a few years there'd been, in the 2000s and early 2010s, there'd been a conceit entering the Anglosphere that we thought, in the Fukuyama sense, that we'd ended history. And I remember Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he showed some statistics to say violence had been dropping over time, with the implication it would continue to drop. But actually, this assumption that we can forecast the future, I think reflects the exceptional circumstance we've been living in for 70 years. If you went back 150 years, you would have been laughed at if someone told you that they could predict the future, not in a theological sense of the chicken bones, but in a scientific sense that we as a society are getting better at being human beings. I think throughout human history, most people would have laughed at that concept. But for some reason in the post-World War II era, we began to believe that the world was a neutral sandbox in which we could act. The wars were neutral. Even when there was the war, the Cold War, it was kind of a neutral, bureaucratic sort of system to play that out with a set of rules, and hence the proxy wars and so on. So it seems to me that we've lived through an era that's been long enough that we believe it's how all of life must always be, which is an era in which we think it's possible to forecast because the frame of reference is settled within which we play with the political economy. But actually what's been happening is, through arguably climate, but certainly things like COVID and certainly wars, we're beginning to realize that there is no frame of reference. Everything is in play. And if everything's in play, you have no stable backdrop. And if you've got no stable backdrop, you can't point out the relative motion. You have no Archimedean point to view what's happening, to step outside and view things. You can't forecast. So the first point I think I'd say is that the Ukraine war is a good example of that. There is no such thing as the better angels of our nature winning in the end. That the human condition is the human condition. It's not going to change. The second thing I'd say, to do with your earlier comments there, was that where you talked about people losing faith in expertise and technocracy. Do you remember the phrase post-truth?
Yes.
So the post-truth phrase is interesting. We're not using it as much now. But in about 2017, 18, it was used quite a lot. I always thought post-truth was misunderstood, because people often use the phrase post-truth as a pejorative to dismiss people who had irrationally lost faith in experts, to say these people no longer believe in the truth. But it implied there is a truth, they just don't believe in it. I think the post-truth concept was the other way around. I think it was people finally coming to recognize that the people who we'd put on a pedestal as the experts who had the truth actually didn't have it, that the emperor had no clothes. And I think that began for me in 2008, or maybe 2007, when the chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, who'd been in that role for almost 30 years, overseeing a booming economy since 1980, the neoliberal period of Reagan and Bush and Clinton. And he was interviewed asked, why do you think this financial crisis has happened? And he thought about it and he said, I think the problem was we had the wrong theory of how the world worked. And what I found extraordinarily hubristic about that statement is the presumption that he had a theory of how the world worked. Just the hubris of that is jaw-dropping to me. And I think at that moment people realized that these people may not actually have a theory of how they're being successful. Retrospectively, we tend to like to mythologize our own success.
We do, especially in the West. We do. We
love
become
it.
very proud of.
Well, another example of us doing so, the intervention in Afghanistan, was basically a way of, if you could think of it, at least I think, of us saying, we feel, having won the Cold War, that we've been very successful. We think we're more successful because we have a theory of how the world works, democracy, human rights, and so on. So we're going to flat pack it like IKEA furniture and sell it to everyone. We're going to diagnose everyone else, categorize them as fragile states. We're going to be evangelicals bringing them this idea and imposing on these ideas. But the truth is, what we did when we went to Afghanistan, in my view, was the equivalent of political economic Esperanto. Esperanto was a language founded in 1890. The idea was it would be a universal language that everyone could speak. Actually, it had a very sort of European grammar structure, but the presumption was it would be a language that transcended local differences. Now, of course, it never really became what people hoped when they invented it, but there's 100,000 people who speak it as an eccentricity. I think when we went to Afghanistan, but it's not a language that exists anywhere in the real world. When we went to Afghanistan and we said we want to establish a country run with good governance, the rule of law, human rights, and so on, what we were doing was taking an idea of ourselves that we thought we were, which didn't actually exist anywhere. The type of state they're trying to build in Afghanistan doesn't even exist in the United States, but they were trying to build it there. And for me, they were trying to build a sort of Esperanto culture that didn't really exist anywhere. And
This is this utopian idea of Rousseau that a human being, as a human being, exists somewhere, but it's never like this. It's this conservative thought which very strongly shows us no, human being is always embedded in the culture, in the society, in the place and geography, and in the history and in a certain tradition, and all of those things have an impact on the person, but also on the whole society.
I'd agree, and I think there's a crucial distinction because, of course, you're the common sense generation is your title, right? And it's interesting because I think one of the core elements of common sense is to have the humility to accept the world as it is, rather than to have the hubris to impose on the world what you think it ought to be for other people. Because not only do you and I see the world slightly differently, but actually I see the world differently sometimes depending on how many cups of tea I've had, you know? And that's not a fault, it's a feature of being human. We are our plurality. That's what makes us so creative. It makes us human. The question isn't whether we need to establish a standardized world. It's simply if we can create a society where different perspectives can rub together but create light, not heat. I mean, I believe that friction is a dependable source of illumination. You rub things together, you get some light. Right now, we live in a very polarized society where the main difference, I think, in the polarized society we live in is a very interesting difference, I think, from, say, a few decades ago. A few decades ago, people in the 20th century, for instance, take communism, capitalism, they actually were united on something. They agreed on what the problem was. They said the problem is political economy. The capitalist said more market, the communist said more state, but they agreed on the problem, which was political economic. The problem is now we no longer agree on what the problem is. But the problem is we've replaced it where we think the problem is each other. So you know, you'll say you're the disease and I'll say you're the disease and I'm the cure, and vice versa. And this, I think, is the difference between the sort of center-right and center-left and far-right and far-left, whatever these terms mean now, is the difference between the center-left and center-right is they typically agreed on the problem and disagreed on the solution. The difference between the far left and the far right is they disagree on the problem. Why? Because they think the problem is each other. It's inherently ad hominem. And if you fight fire with fire like that, you end up just with inferno. So I think if we, in the culture right now, we have this pandemic of hubris where everyone believes they alone have the answer and everyone else should adopt it. What we've completely lost in the culture is the humility to say, I don't even necessarily understand the question. And I certainly am not confident I have the answer. And if we just had the humility to recognize that there are a plurality of answers that need to coexist without leading to conflicts, then I think we'd probably have a healthy society.
This is the fact that we very often forget, because of this, what I called the dictatorship very often of two political parties or of two dimensions, so right and left, but very, as you mentioned, those radical left, and that we don't look at the state interest. So as the fact that there is something which unites us all, and this is the state interest. And never, I think this is the power actually of British monarchy, that despite the fact of whatever party wins, there is always king or queen who represents the state of the interest of the state. So someone who is there no matter what, and represents all British people. But I found a funny thing, but there was a moment when, at least in Poland, a lot of right wing were taking John Paul II as their like a face of, and then I remember stating it somewhere in the TV, saying, but you know what? I mean the lefties though, they can also it's also theirs, John Paul II, and they also have a part in the church. And they were outraged about this, but they forget about this, the fact that after all, at least in the States, we all take part in the same game, and the outcome should be the welfare, the good living of the whole society, and not just destroying the opponents.
It's interesting you mentioned the Queen, or the English Queen, and the thing I found, my thought on the Queen when she died was that she understood something, I think, quite profound and quite rare today. She understood there was nothing she could ever say that was more powerful than her silence. Because she spent 70 years actually saying nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but she understood structurally there was nothing she could say that would play more of a structural role that was positive than her silence. At the center of it's kind of like, by analogy, you know, when you see a hurricane, you have the hurricane raging, but the eye of the storm is calm. And the Queen is like the eye of the societal storm. She was the calm center, and she understood that role. And I don't think she even understood it. I have no idea if she understood it expressly, but that was her intuition. She was very interesting like that. The fear I had when Charles became not prime minister, but he became king, was that he'd been in public life for 50 years, and he was very vocal, as he should be, because he had to find a place and he had to say something. Only the monarch themselves had the opportunity to be silent. And actually, since he's become king, he's remained quite silent, which is very interesting, and that he's done that. But I think this comes back to the humility thing of, the hubris is in having all the answers. Humility is saying, you know what, there's no answer I can give that's maybe more constructive than frankly being silent or indeed listening. It's often the case that, you know, I think we live in a society where we're always being incentivized to talk. You know, I talk for a living to some extent, and and that's fun. But actually, I know if I want to find people to help me in my life, I find the people who are good listeners, and the people who are good listeners often are the most secure people, actually, because they don't need to project onto you who they are. So there's an extraordinary power in silence, constructive silence.
And I think it's a great punchline for this interview. Calum, thank you very much for being our guest.
My pleasure, thank you.
And also to you, the viewers of Common Sense Generation, as it seems silence is sometimes more important even than speaking. And I say it paradoxically in this show. So anyway, thank you for watching our show. And I also thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.